The first gasp of humiliation struck before Lady Charlotte Haraway even crossed the threshold of Harrington House. A baroness, draped in layers of velvet and arrogance, let her laughter spill like breaking glass across the marble hall. "Pray, Charlotte," she said, voice sharp and cruel, "tell us again how the Haraways hope to preserve their wretched fortune while dancing in gowns long past their fashion?" The assembled guests, gilded in silk and jewels, tittered in the polite cruelty that only London society could muster. Charlotte's heart thudded unevenly, the rhythm of shame echoing each footfall as she moved further into the hall, her gloved hands clenching against the delicate folds of her gown. Every whisper, every pointed glance, felt like a tiny dagger, yet she held her posture with all the dignity she could summon, though her cheeks betrayed her, rose-staining pale skin, trembling under the scrutiny of 100 judgmental eyes. She had arrived with hope clutched like a fragile locket, believing that manners, restraint, and a quiet intelligence could shield her from the sharp teeth of gossip. But here, under the grand chandeliers and the watchful eyes of the ton, her hopes were as exposed as her gown, slightly faded, slightly worn, a testament to her family's dwindling fortune. Even the Viscount she had once secretly admired, tall and darkly handsome, offered nothing more than a fleeting glance of cold indifference, a silent affirmation of her social failure. Each step forward seemed heavier than the last, yet she pressed on, for retreat would confirm the whispers already circulating, that Lady Charlotte Haraway was nothing more than a faded shadow of former prestige. And then he appeared. Not announced, not heralded, but unmistakable, his presence slicing through the room's murmur like a winter wind. The Duke of Ravensfield, newly returned from the continent, observed quietly from the balcony, his posture rigid with the discipline of duty, yet his eyes softened when they fell upon her. Charlotte felt, in that brief, piercing moment, a curious weight of scrutiny, not mockery, not disdain, but something subtler, something unsettlingly intimate. Her pulse stuttered, and for the first time that evening her resolve faltered. Society's cruelty, however, was far from spent. A neighboring lady, perturbed by Charlotte's quiet grace, seized the opportunity to lash out. "A pity," she whispered loudly enough for several to hear, "that a Haraway must hope for a title to mask such mediocrity." Charlotte's stomach twisted, the shame threatening to spill over into tears she could not afford. She reminded herself, with every ounce of breath, that dignity required endurance, that a gentle answer, a soft curtsy, could wield a kind of power the world often failed to recognize. It was then that the room's attention shifted, a delicate hush settling over the murmurs. An announcement, formal and commanding, cut through the fragile quiet. The voice of the master of ceremonies, firm and ceremonial, declared that Lady Charlotte Haraway was to be united in marriage with the Duke of Ravensfield. The effect was instantaneous: gasps, murmurs, a ripple of shocked amusement and scandalized approval. Charlotte's knees felt suddenly unsteady beneath the weight of her skirts. She had expected surprise, perhaps polite inquiry, but the mixture of awe and judgment in the room pressed against her like a physical force. Her life, until this moment guided by careful propriety, had been thrust into the center of a story she had neither authored nor anticipated. The Duke descended from the balcony with measured steps, each one a testament to his control and training. Charlotte felt the air shift, the collective scrutiny of society sharpening with each movement he made. When he reached her side, the murmurs faded into an almost reverent silence. He bowed, the gesture deep and deliberate, one hand extended in formal courtesy. Charlotte, trembling, returned the curtsy, her own hand hovering near his, neither touching nor withdrawing, caught in the weight of expectation. His eyes, a dark storm tempered with something faintly luminous, held hers for a moment longer than propriety demanded. "Lady Charlotte," he said softly, his voice steady yet threaded with an emotion she could not name, "I trust this union shall prove fortuitous for us both." The words were measured, carefully chosen, but beneath their restraint she sensed a quiet warmth, a trace of regard that set her heart to a peculiar rhythm. The Duke's hand lingered in gesture, not touching, not commanding, yet offering the faintest acknowledgement of her humanity, of her courage to face a room full of judgment without faltering entirely. In that instant, Charlotte realized that the trial she had feared was not merely the ball or the scornful whispers. It was the uncharted intimacy of obligation, the unknown weight of marrying a man she had scarcely met. And yet, within that uncertainty, a spark of something unexpected stirred, a flicker of curiosity, of hope, of recognition that perhaps the man before her was not merely a title or a duty, but a person capable of thought, of feeling, of private regard beneath the polished veneer of aristocratic discipline. The murmurs of the room continued, though their sting was dulled by the gravity of the moment. The Duke's gaze never wavered, yet his lips remained still, offering no declaration beyond the careful formality of his bow. Charlotte, despite the tremor in her hands and the ache in her chest, lifted her chin and allowed a measured, composed breath to steady her. The humiliation, sharp as it had been, was tempered now by a delicate thread of anticipation, a possibility that the night might hold more than ridicule and rumor. Yet even as the Duke moved to take his place beside her, a subtle tension lingered in the space between them. There were unspoken questions. Would he value her beyond her lineage? Would she find within herself the courage to meet the expectations placed upon her? And most pressingly, what secret lay behind the quiet, observing eyes that had followed her across the marble hall? Charlotte's pulse quickened, a mix of fear, hope, and curiosity intertwining into a single fragile chord. She sensed that this moment, her public exposure, her forced engagement, the Duke's enigmatic regard, was but the opening act of a story whose depth she had yet to fathom. And as she stepped forward, following him through the whispering crowd, her mind clung to the tiniest fragment of certainty, that tonight, amidst scandal and judgment, something irrevocable had begun. The Duke paused at the doorway, turning his gaze upon her once more. His eyes softened, and for the briefest instant the full weight of years of duty, of hidden admiration seemed to hang in that silent look. "Do not fear what the world whispers," he murmured, so quietly that only she could hear. "There are truths yet unseen, and perhaps in time, you shall come to know them." Charlotte's heart trembled, caught between the sting of public shame and the quiet thrill of recognition. She curtsied once more, lower this time, not out of submission but of cautious acknowledgement. The room behind them buzzed with speculation, yet in the space between them, the hush of possibility lingered, fragile and electric. And in that hush Charlotte felt for the first time that the story awaiting her, though bound by duty, whispered scandal and uncertainty, might hold something entirely unexpected. The first glimmer of a connection that was, against all odds, entirely her own. The scandal ignited before the ink on the engagement announcement could dry. By morning, the Tun was aflame with whispers that Lady Charlotte Haraway had ensnared the Duke of Ravensfield with calculated intent, a cruel caricature that stripped her of any remaining dignity. Invitations were rescinded, carriage rides avoided, and polite acquaintances offered only perfunctory nods. Charlotte, seated at the breakfast table of her family's modest London home, felt the sting of betrayal not from her own heart but from the world that refused to see her virtue. Her father, pale and uneasy, shuffled papers as if bureaucracy could mend the fissures in their social standing, while her mother's eyes, though fierce with maternal protection, were red-rimmed from sleepless nights. Charlotte took a measured sip of tea, the heat burning her throat, grounding her in the reality of the moment. She had survived public humiliation, only to be assaulted now by rumor and conjecture. Yet within the swirl of scandal, one presence remained a constant, though elusive: the Duke. He had returned to Ravensfield House, the ancestral estate that loomed over the countryside with the weight of centuries, and already, his careful gestures had begun to reach her. Each morning, a small token would arrive: a sprig of winter roses, a single handwritten note in impeccable handwriting, or a volume of poetry whose margins held tiny observations meant for her eyes alone. The gifts were neither ostentatious nor trivial. They were precise, deliberate, and spoke of a quiet attentiveness that defied the gossip swirling about them. Charlotte, though cautious, felt a flicker of something dangerous: hope, perhaps, or the tentative stirring of trust. She held each gift as though it were a fragile bridge between two worlds, one defined by duty, social expectation, and rumor, the other by the possibility of authentic human regard. Society, however, would not allow such a bridge to remain untested. At the fortnightly tea gathering of Lady Hawthorne, Charlotte found herself once again confronted with the malicious whispers of peers. "How delightful," Lady Hawthorne said, her voice sharp as thorns, "that the Duke has chosen a bride whose family cannot so much as host a dinner without scandal." Her companions tittered, and one bold gentleman suggested that perhaps Charlotte's charms had been less persuasive than her family's desperation. Charlotte's chest tightened, the burn of indignity rising to her eyes. She reminded herself, silently and stubbornly, that propriety demanded restraint, that a soft curtsy and a measured bow were worth more than any retort. Yet even as she contained her reaction, she felt the unspoken truth of the room's fascination. The Duke, absent from the gathering, remained a subject of speculation, his intentions cloaked in mystery. It was during this very gathering that a subtle, yet profound, act shifted the tenor of Charlotte's days. The Duke, arriving unexpectedly to consult his solicitor on estate matters, paused in the room, scanning the assembly with an imperceptible calculation. His gaze found Charlotte, and without a word, he stepped to her side. The room, aware of his presence, hushed. The murmurs ceased, replaced by the heavy expectation of propriety. "Rumor has a habit of exaggeration," he said, his voice low but resolute, audible to those within earshot. "And I find the truth far more satisfactory than gossip." The words were clipped, formal, yet they carried an unmistakable note of loyalty, an affirmation that the world's cruelty need not define her. Charlotte's pulse quickened, her surprise tempered by a quiet relief that the Duke, though a stranger and personal acquaintance, possessed both discernment and courage. Still, even his protection could not shield her from the intrigue that clung to her like a second skin. Letters arrived from London society, some neutral, some laced with veiled threats, each one an attempt to destabilize her resolve. And though the Duke's gestures of attention were delicate, they began to reveal a pattern. He noticed her small acts of kindness, her patience with servants, her quiet intelligence that spoke volumes to those who chose to observe. Charlotte, previously accustomed to being overlooked or underestimated, felt herself under scrutiny in a wholly new way. She began to watch him in return, observing the weight of his shoulders, the distant shadow in his eyes, and the small moments when he allowed himself to appear vulnerable. A sigh as he read letters from abroad, a tremor in his voice when discussing the burdens of Ravensfield estate. A turning point arrived unexpectedly one evening, during a dinner arranged to cement Charlotte's understanding of her future responsibilities. The servants moved silently, the candles casting elongated shadows across polished wood. A cousin, ever watchful, leaned toward Charlotte and whispered, "Mark my words, this Duke admires you for reasons he himself cannot name. Be wary, for admiration in our circles is often a prelude to ruin." Charlotte felt the words like frost upon her spine, part warning, part acknowledgement of an unspoken truth. She realized that her life was no longer her own. It had been woven into a tapestry of expectation, observation, and intrigue, each thread pulling her toward an unknown future. Yet within that constraint, there existed a subtle promise. The Duke's regard, measured though it was, offered a sliver of protection against the world's relentless judgment. Days passed, each marked by careful observation and measured interaction. Charlotte found herself eagerly anticipating the morning's note, the daily token, each small act bridging the gulf between scandal and intimacy. She began to recognize patterns in the Duke's gestures, the subtleties in his phrasing, the way he positioned himself in rooms to shield her from the harsher currents of society. And though rumor still clung like a persistent fog, the seeds of trust began to take root in her heart. She dared to imagine that perhaps, within the confines of duty and expectation, a genuine connection could flourish. One night, as winter deepened and the frost traced delicate patterns upon the estate windows, a final token arrived that would alter the rhythm of her days. It was a letter, sealed with the Ravensfield crest, addressed in handwriting that trembled ever so slightly with restraint. The Duke, in sending this, had requested that she open it only after their wedding, an act of patience and anticipation that spoke more eloquently than any spoken word. Charlotte traced the seal with trembling fingers, sensing in that single gesture the weight of his thoughtfulness, the deliberate construction of a bridge from propriety to possibility. Her pulse quickened and a quiet, electric thrill stirred in her chest. The scandal, though ever present, had been tempered by his subtle devotion. The world's whispers had begun to lose their sting in the face of the Duke's attentiveness. Charlotte understood that the journey ahead would be fraught with trials, with gossip and expectation, with challenges to her dignity and courage. Yet the small, precise gestures, the roses, the poetry, the letter, offered a tantalizing hint of something more profound. A man capable of respect, of care, and of recognition beyond the superficial judgments of society. And as she held the sealed letter close, heart fluttering with a mixture of fear and anticipation, Charlotte felt the first true stirrings of hope. The scandal had revealed her fragility. The Duke's quiet gestures had revealed his depth. In that fragile balance, a subtle promise lingered, unspoken but undeniable, that the path before her, though uncertain and fraught with social peril, might yet lead to a bond neither rumor nor expectation could dismantle. Charlotte's eyes lifted toward the frosted window pane, gazing into the night with a mixture of trepidation and yearning. She felt, with a quiet certainty that startled her, that her life was no longer hers alone to command, yet it had never felt more alive. And in the hush that followed, a thought settled deep within her. The man who observed, who guarded, who offered subtle signs of regard, might hold the key to a truth as yet unseen, a truth that could transform her existence utterly, if only she dared to cross the threshold of their shared future. The first night struck like a storm breaking over a fragile coast. Charlotte had imagined it might arrive with grandeur, with ceremonial propriety and the stiff, perfumed courtesies of aristocracy. Instead, it was quiet, almost unbearably so, the heavy oak doors of Ravensfield estate closing behind her like the final seal of a world she had not yet known. She stood in the dim hallway, her gloved hands trembling slightly as the servants withdrew, leaving only the hushed crackle of the hearth and the distant echo of night beyond tall windows. Every instinct in her body urged caution, yet curiosity, mingled with the faint thrill of dread, pulled her forward. The Duke had already taken his place near the fire, his back straight, shoulders rigid, and yet there was an unspoken tension in the curve of his stance, a tremor beneath the surface of his composure that suggested more than mere formality. Charlotte lowered herself into the high-backed chair across from him, the firelight painting flickering patterns across her face, accentuating the delicate flush that had nothing to do with embarrassment and everything to do with anticipation. The silence stretched taut, broken only by the occasional sigh of the wind outside, rattling the leaded panes. She dared not speak, uncertain whether her words would be met with warmth or cold duty. He, for his part, seemed lost in thought, eyes distant yet sharply observant, as though measuring not just the room but her presence within it. The weight of centuries of expectation seemed to hang between them, a ghostly reminder that they were bound not merely by personal choice but by the invisible chains of lineage and reputation. Finally, the Duke's gaze settled upon her, piercing yet gentle. "Lady Charlotte," he said, his voice low, measured, almost fragile in its restraint. "I fear that in all these years, my admiration for you has been a silent burden, carried without hope of acknowledgement." The words, spoken so quietly, landed with the force of revelation. Charlotte felt her breath catch. He spoke not as a husband claiming a title, nor as a man performing ritual duty, but as someone offering a glimpse into the inner workings of a heart long constrained by duty and solitude. She shifted slightly, curiosity outweighing the caution that had governed her movements for weeks. "A burden, my lord?" she asked softly, her voice trembling not with fear but with an urgent desire to understand. "And what might a woman do with such a burden, if it is hers to bear unknowingly?" He leaned forward, elbows resting lightly on his knees, the firelight dancing in his dark eyes. "You acted once with a kindness so rare that I could not forget it," he confessed, "though you were unaware that any eyes witnessed it. A harsh winter, a servant boy trembling at the market square, and you, without hesitation, intervened, shielding him from the cruelty of others. That act, so simple in your view, revealed the measure of your character. I observed quietly, believing it would remain unnoticed, yet I carried the memory with me, across distance and duty, until the moment I could return." Charlotte's fingers tightened around the folds of her gown, and a quiet, almost inaudible gasp escaped her. The memory he described was not one she had ever deemed remarkable, and yet here it was, elevated into a significance she had never imagined. A strange mix of embarrassment and wonder colored her thoughts. I did not think it mattered," she whispered, her voice barely carrying over the crackle of the fire. "It was a small kindness, nothing more. Surely it does not merit such attention." "But it does," he said firmly, the tension in his posture softening just enough to betray his vulnerability. "It matters to me more than words can convey. I returned to England bearing the weight of my duties, the expectations of my house, and the loneliness that accompanies them. And yet, I discovered that within this life of obligation, there exists a truth that has long eluded me, that courage and kindness and unspoken strength reside not in titles or wealth, but in the character of those who act without expectation of reward. You, Charlotte, embody that truth. And I could not marry you merely for duty. I wished to know you, to honor you before the world demanded it of us." Charlotte felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, unbidden and unwelcome, yet impossible to resist. She had entered this union braced for ridicule, for the cold formalities of a marriage of convenience, yet here in the quiet of the estate's great hall, she faced a man willing to offer her truth, unshielded by etiquette or pretense. The enormity of the moment pressed upon her chest, and she realized that for the first time, the Duke and she were bound not merely by obligation, but by something that approached trust, delicate, nascent, yet undeniable. In an impulse she could neither fully explain nor suppress, she rose and crossed the small distance between them, seating herself slightly nearer to the fire. Her hands rested lightly on the chair's arms, still keeping a careful distance, and her voice, though low, carried a note of tentative courage. "Then I must ask, my lord, what becomes of us now that truth has been spoken?" He hesitated, eyes softened, lips pressing together in a moment of uncharacteristic hesitation. "We proceed carefully," he murmured, "with patience and respect. I would not rush the heart, nor place upon yours the burdens I have borne so long. Let us learn one another, quietly, without the expectations of the world intruding upon the fragile beginnings of trust." Charlotte nodded, understanding that this was no surrender to convention, no yielding to expectation, but rather the quiet construction of something far more profound. In that moment, the room, the fire, and the shadows became less an arena of scrutiny and more a sanctuary of possibility. She dared to believe that a connection, built not on rumor or obligation but on recognition and respect, could flourish. The hours passed, marked only by the fire's rhythmic flicker and the occasional sigh of wind against the manor walls. They spoke in measured tones, carefully, about their lives before this union, about the weight of responsibility, and about fleeting joys, books, winter walks, the unexpected beauty in simple acts of kindness. Each revelation, small as it might seem, wove an invisible thread between them, binding the Duke's stoic restraint to Charlotte's cautious optimism. As the night deepened, Charlotte became aware of a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The rigid walls of expectation that had defined her engagement seemed to relax, replaced by the tentative intimacy of shared confidences. She realized that the scandal, the gossip, and even her earlier humiliation mattered less now than the quiet truth of his regard. Yet even as her heart stirred with a fragile hope, an undercurrent of uncertainty remained. The shadow of duty, the expectations of society, and the unknown depths of the Duke's thoughts still lingered like the final embers of the hearth, glowing but not fully revealed. Finally, the Duke reached into the pocket of his waistcoat and produced a folded letter, sealed with the Ravensfield crest. "I have asked you to wait until our wedding night to open this," he said, voice low, "for it contains truths I wished you to consider only after the vows bound us in duty and respect. It is a testament, perhaps, to what I could not speak aloud, and a promise of patience until you might choose to embrace it." Charlotte's fingers trembled as she accepted the letter. The seal felt heavy, weighty with intent, and her pulse quickened at the knowledge that its contents might reveal not merely sentiment, but a revelation that could alter the fragile balance of trust they had begun to construct. The firelight flickered across the embossed crest, and for the first time she understood that the journey ahead, though fraught with uncertainty, held the possibility of something profound. That admiration, kindness, and courage could weave together to form a bond neither scandal nor society could destroy. She held the letter to her chest, heart pounding with anticipation, the Duke's dark eyes upon her, calm yet luminous, reflecting the firelight and the unspoken weight of shared understanding. And as the wind whispered against the manor walls, a quiet thought settled within her, fragile yet electric. Perhaps the truths yet unseen, the words yet unspoken, could bind them together in ways neither expectation nor duty could ever sever. The day began with a gale that tore across the Ravensfield estate, rattling windows and scattering autumn leaves like whispers of gossip carried on the wind. Charlotte, standing by the breakfast table, felt the same turbulence within her chest. Letters from London had arrived overnight, each more insistent than the last, implying that her marriage was a mistake, that the Duke's favor was temporary, that her family's dwindling influence had been overestimated. Yet as she read the words, a quiet steadiness took root in her heart, a recognition that the measure of her life could not be dictated by rumor alone. The Duke, seated across from her, noted her composure with a faint, approving smile, his dark eyes calm amidst the storm of words and expectation. The morning passed with meticulous attention to household matters, servants moving silently, rooms echoing with the weight of tradition. Charlotte found herself drawn to the library, where the Duke often retreated, a sanctuary lined with leather-bound volumes and the faint scent of beeswax polish. He rose as she entered, not with the rigid formality of duty, but with the subtle warmth of acknowledgement, a gesture that spoke of regard without pretense. "The world is insistent," he said softly, "yet I have found that it listens, however briefly, to truth and courage when they present themselves without apology." Charlotte felt a thrill of quiet pride at the observation, realizing that her presence in his life had begun to matter beyond obligation. By mid-afternoon, society's scrutiny became unavoidable. A carriage arrived unannounced, bearing a cousin of the Duchess of Hawthorne, who had made a specialty of observing and commenting upon Charlotte's every action. The woman's eyes, sharp with judgment, fixed upon her like a hawk surveying prey. "Your Grace," she began, voice dripping with condescension, "it seems the Duke's patience is tested only by the necessity of decorum. Shall we hope that your conduct will mirror the esteem with which he regards you?" Charlotte's fingers tightened imperceptibly around the edge of her glove, yet she met the inquiry with a calmness that surprised even herself. "I intend, madam," she replied with measured clarity, "to honor the obligations before me while remaining faithful to the principles that guide my life. I hope that proves sufficient." The cousin's lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes narrowing, but no retort emerged. Charlotte had, in a single exchange, shifted the balance of authority, asserting a quiet dignity that could not be ignored. Later, the Duke guided her to the conservatory, where light filtered through glass panes like liquid amber. Plants thrived in careful order, and the faint scent of earth mingled with the richness of blooming roses. It was there, amidst the tranquil greenery, that the Duke spoke again, not of duty or propriety but of admiration. "Charlotte, I have observed you through days of scrutiny and rumor, through the whispers of those who delight in diminishing worth," he said, his voice low, imbued with solemnity. "And yet, I find that each act of kindness, each thoughtful decision, each measured word, has only deepened my respect. You move through this world with a courage few possess, and it is that courage which binds my regard to you." Charlotte, her breath caught, felt the words settle upon her like the softest cloak of warmth, shielding her from the chill of expectation and societal judgment. The afternoon waned, and news arrived that threatened to fracture the fragile calm. A letter bearing scandalous insinuations regarding her family's finances, suggesting impropriety and potential disgrace. Charlotte's heart clenched, yet she did not falter. The Duke, sensing her tension, took her hand in a gesture that was neither possessive nor ceremonious, but grounding. "We face this together," he said, his voice firm yet gentle, "as partners, as equals. No whisper, no letter, no shadow of rumor shall dictate the measure of our actions or the truth we carry between us." Charlotte felt a tremor of relief, the knowledge that the man beside her recognized her strength, her agency, and her virtue. Evening arrived with a crimson glow that poured through the windows, painting the walls with fire and gold. They walked together along the terrace, the wind tugging at Charlotte's skirts and the faint chill prickling her skin. "I see now," she said softly, "that our union need not be merely a bond of duty. It may be a bond of trust if we dare to cultivate it." The Duke's eyes darkened with something tender, almost reverent. "And I shall endeavor," he murmured, "to honor that trust with every word, every gesture, every moment we share henceforth. Let the world speak, we shall write our own narrative quietly, yet with conviction." Later that night, they hosted a small gathering of close acquaintances, a deliberate choice to test both their unity and the whispers of society. Observers noted Charlotte's poise, her wit, and the gentle yet unmistakable confidence she displayed. The Duke remained at her side, not commanding attention, but offering subtle reinforcement. A nod, a whispered remark, a measured smile that spoke volumes to those attuned to nuance. Whispers of admiration began to replace murmurs of doubt. The tide of rumor, though persistent, had been deflected by visible partnership and mutual respect. As the evening drew to a close, Charlotte and the Duke retreated to the privacy of the drawing-room, the fire casting long, dancing shadows across the polished floor. He turned to her, eyes luminous with conviction, and spoke with deliberate clarity. "Let it be known, to any who would question, that my esteem for you is neither superficial nor fleeting. You are, in every measure, a woman of depth, courage, and discernment. The world may continue its chatter, but it cannot touch the bond forged in truth and mutual regard." Charlotte, her chest swelling with gratitude and relief, felt the final weight of uncertainty ease, replaced by a steady confidence in their shared path. Yet even as they spoke, a messenger arrived with urgent dispatch. A note from London, brief but alarming, hinting that the Haraway estate faced renewed scrutiny, potentially threatening the security of Charlotte's family and, by extension, the peace of their union. The Duke's expression, though composed, flickered with the slightest shadow of concern, and Charlotte recognized in that instant that their bond, however firm, would be tested anew by the relentless currents of society. Charlotte held the note in her hands, fingers trembling with anticipation and resolve. She looked to the Duke, whose dark eyes met hers with unwavering steadiness, offering strength without diminishing her agency. "Together we shall navigate this," he said softly, "for truth and courage are ours to wield, and no whisper or shadow shall dictate the measure of our lives." She felt the resonance of those words deep within her heart, a promise both private and profound, yet the note's contents pulsed with latent uncertainty, a challenge yet unmet, a test whose resolution remained unseen. As the fire sputtered low and the house settled into the quiet of night, Charlotte realized that the days ahead would require both vigilance and courage, a partnership that demanded equal measure of insight, patience, and steadfastness. The societal tide, though temporarily stilled, would rise again, and they would be called upon to navigate the treacherous currents of expectation, rumor, and intrigue. Yet, in the gentle clasp of the Duke's hand and the quiet acknowledgement of mutual trust, she found a foundation upon which to build, fragile yet unbreakable, ready to withstand the storms yet to come. And as she folded the London dispatch carefully, her mind clinging to the gravity of the message, Charlotte felt a thrill of both fear and hope. The union of duty and devotion, though tested by scandal and circumstance, had taken root, and in that root lay the possibility of triumph, not merely over gossip or expectation, but over the uncertainties of the heart itself. A truth yet unseen awaited, and the night held within it the promise that the next challenge might reveal the depth of courage, resilience, and love that neither rumor nor society could diminish. The messenger arrived with urgent steps, shattering the fragile calm of dawn. Charlotte opened the letter with fingers trembling, and the words leapt from the page with the weight of inevitability. A creditor, emboldened by months of rumors, threatened to seize the Haraway estate unless payment was rendered immediately. Her stomach knotted, chest tightening as the gravity of the threat pressed upon her. For a moment, the world felt cruelly small, her past humiliation, society's whispers, and the fragile hope she had cultivated all converging into one impossible moment. She glanced toward the Duke, whose dark eyes were already upon her, steady and unwavering, a pillar against the tide of uncertainty. "Charlotte," he said softly but with a firmness that left no room for doubt, "we will face this together. Whatever challenge the world presents, we confront it as partners, and neither rumor nor misfortune shall dictate our actions." His hand, warm and grounding, closed over hers, conveying reassurance without diminishment, strength without coercion. Charlotte felt the first true flicker of courage bloom within her, the knowledge that their union was not merely ceremonial, but a bond of resilience, trust, and mutual regard. They moved quickly, consulting letters, accounts, and legal documents, Charlotte's intellect and meticulous care matching the Duke's strategic acumen. The hours passed in a quiet whirlwind, punctuated only by brief exchanges of counsel and the soft scratching of quills on parchment. Each decision, each step, demonstrated that their partnership was more than symbolic, it was practical, effective, and grounded in a shared sense of responsibility. Charlotte marveled at the clarity of the Duke's mind, tempered by the gentleness with which he guided her understanding, never commanding, never condescending, yet allowing her insight to shape their course. As the sun climbed higher, casting pale gold through the great windows, word arrived that the creditor had reluctantly agreed to postpone any action, impressed by the resolute partnership of the Duke and his new wife. The relief that surged through Charlotte was tempered by the recognition of the fragility of their triumph. Society's scrutiny and the ever-present shadow of expectation remained, persistent and vigilant. The Duke, sensing her conflicted emotions, reached out and brushed a loose strand of hair from her forehead, a gesture so simple yet so intimate that Charlotte's breath caught. "Our strength lies not merely in fortune or title," he murmured, "but in the courage to act together, to meet adversity with unity rather than fear." That evening they walked through the gardens of Ravensfield, the chill of early autumn brushing against their cheeks, leaves crackling beneath their feet. The world outside remained harsh, indifferent, and yet within the quiet of the estate, Charlotte felt a profound sense of peace. The Duke spoke little, but the weight of his presence was itself an assurance, a silent vow that whatever challenges arose, they would face them side by side. Charlotte, emboldened by the day's triumph, allowed herself a rare smile, feeling the tension that had shadowed her since the ball eased just enough to make space for hope. Night fell with a velvet hush, and the couple returned indoors to the warmth of the hearth. The fire's glow danced across the room, illuminating portraits of ancestors who had faced their own trials, silent witnesses to the unfolding of a new story. The Duke turned toward her, expression softened, eyes luminous with sincerity. "Charlotte, in this union we have endured whispers, doubt and fear," he said. "Yet through it all, we have discovered that admiration, respect, and partnership are not merely ideals, but truths we can live." Charlotte's hands rose instinctively, resting lightly upon his arm, her heart swelling with the gravity of his words and the intimacy of their shared experience. They spoke then of the future, not in grandiose terms but in measured, deliberate reflections. Charlotte realized that the marriage she had feared would be rigid, constrained by duty, had become a sanctuary in which courage and trust could flourish. The Duke, for his part, revealed the quiet moments he had cherished, observing her kindness to servants, the gentle firmness with which she navigated social expectations, the rare glimmers of warmth beneath the careful composure of her public demeanor. Each revelation bound them more tightly together, an invisible thread of understanding and admiration weaving through the hours of shared conversation. Later, as the house settled into the quiet of night, Charlotte felt the weight of accomplishment mingled with anticipation. They had faced the first true test of their partnership and emerged stronger, united, and quietly victorious against the scrutiny and rumor that had plagued them. And yet, in the midst of their triumph, a subtle tension lingered, a reminder that life's challenges never end. A soft knock at the door interrupted the intimate silence, and a servant handed the Duke a missive bearing the Ravensfield seal. His expression, though composed, held the faintest flicker of concern, a shadow passing briefly across his otherwise steady gaze. Charlotte's heart quickened, sensing that the next trial was imminent, that the victory of the day, though significant, was but a prelude to a challenge yet unseen. The letter remained unopened in the Duke's hand, yet its presence was enough to tether them to the awareness that the world beyond their sanctuary was unrelenting. Charlotte, standing close, felt the weight of possibility, the tension between accomplishment and anticipation, courage and uncertainty. The night, though quiet, held within it the promise of revelation, and in that hush, a shared understanding passed between them. They had endured, they had triumphed, yet their story was far from complete. Charlotte met the Duke's eyes, dark and unwavering, and in that silent exchange she recognized the truth of their bond. It was not merely the overcoming of rumor or scandal, not merely the protection of fortune or estate, but the discovery of a partnership rooted in mutual respect, courage, and a nascent, unspoken love. And as the fire flickered low, casting shadows across the room, she felt the thrill of the unknown settle over her. The next challenge, though uncertain, would be met together, and the bond they had forged in trust and admiration would guide them through whatever storms the world might yet deliver.